This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. This is a non-commercial broadcast, so we've shied away from asking viewers to subscribe or follow us. But having subscribers, which is free, helps us to gain support from grant agencies and to continue this series. So if you like us, please tap or click the red subscribe button on YouTube or the follow button on your podcast. This talk is with Varsha Panjwani of New York University, London. Varsha is the host of the well-received and award-winning podcast, Women and Shakespeare. She is also a widely published scholar in Shakespeare studies whose focus has been on Indian Shakespeare adaptations and more broadly on multicultural adaptive practices and the way in which Shakespeare informs and enlivens our current views on gender, race, and culture. This talk is made possible with support from the Aoyama Gakuin Institute of the Humanities. Varsha, you have been super busy during the past few years on several fronts. You are hosting the award-winning podcast, Women and Shakespeare, from New York University, London. You've just finished an introduction to a major edition of Midsummer Night's Dream. To date in your career, you have explored adaptive practices, particularly of Indian drama from both sides of the cultural divide, and have worked diligently in the effort to give a greater voice to those who have been traditionally marginalized in Shakespeare studies in particular. Before moving on to the specifics of your work, may I ask you to give us an overview first of your podcast and what the future might hold for it?
Thank you so much, Thomas. Yes, my podcast, Women and Shakespeare, was born out of frustration, as good projects sometimes are. And what I was still noticing at that time, and I still notice it now, is that the majority of my students are women. However, when it comes to citations in essays and presentations, they were mostly citing male authors. What also was happening is that I found myself, and certainly my colleagues found themselves, at conferences where we were looking at men who were giving keynotes overwhelmingly, and we were on manels or all-male panels. And in theater as well, I learned that actresses had to really push for their interpretation of the roles because the mostly male directors were concentrating on the mostly male characters like Hamlet, Othello, or whatever. This kind of collective silencing, if you like, of women's voices, because there's so many women experts, so it's not like they're not there. In Shakespeare studies, but this kind of collective silencing was frustrating to me, but also was having a very detrimental effect on teaching and my students, because they were all mostly women, and they were seeing that the experts, or who was held as experts, even in public lectures, for example, were all men. And so I just wanted to sort of mitigate the damage of that. And that is how Women and Shakespeare podcast started. And we chose a podcast because what we found in surveys that were done in the UK and US, that actually podcast is a very female-friendly medium. So many women listen to podcasts for longer. There are many more listeners of podcasts that are women. So we thought, why not take a medium that women already like and use it to center women's voices? So that is what the podcast is all about. We invite women who are either scholars or playwrights or stage directors or novelists who work on Shakespeare, and we interview them. So there have been lots of academics like Sarah Olive, Tiffany Stern, Emma Smith, who are also there on your podcast.
Yes.
We have had directors such as Janet Suzman, and we have had playwrights such as Kerry Frampton. We have had novelists such as Mary Bly, Chloe Gong, and I've learned so much out of doing that. One thing I do want to mention is that I produce this podcast with my students. So students act as researchers on the podcast. They act as producers on the podcast. And I'm very, very proud of that fact. So yeah, frustration has led to this podcast.
Well, it's just a wonderfully produced show, and you have the advantage. I'm not sure all the time, but some of the people that I remember listening to, I think you were in person with them. Is that right? Generally, that you can bring them in because people come to London, and people come to Tokyo too, but not for Shakespearean reasons. But these academics, so you can sit across the table from them, and the sound quality is just wonderful. It's very I don't want to use the word polished because that might be a little bit of an off-putting thing in terms of a podcast, but it's very well structured. These are usually run a little bit shorter. I go a little bit longer, but that's just a matter of taste and whatnot. And they are just wonderful people, and you to showcase these people. And when I was first entered into academia, everyone in the humanities was a man. There'd be this one woman, and and in terms of people of color, no, not at all. You never saw this. And there is a feeling now. Of course, you and I attended a conference this past summer, and there was an excellent amount of diversity in terms of the presentations there, multinational, multicultural, and so forth. But that's not what you normally get even now. And guess what, Varsha? I have to confess, a guy like me walks into a room and I'm looking around for people I know, meeting new people like you last summer, and I don't see it. You don't see it. So you see, that's what you do. You bring this out so that we can see this problem, but then also feature these really exquisite intellects and practitioners. You wrote a book about this, and I want to get to the Elements book that you did, the CUP, Cambridge University Press Elements book, where you went into this problem, and I've been through it, and it was enlightening. And you mentioned some more names of people who have been on this series, but let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yes. My book benefited from me being a podcaster, but it wasn't only about my podcast. So the book, as you've mentioned, is very much about how we can use podcasts for feminist teaching in Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the problems, for example, when we are teaching Shakespeare's texts, is that they themselves enact a silencing of women characters. So, for example, I remember reading The Winter's Tale, and Paulina in that she tries to speak truth to power multiple times, and she does. She's formidable. But at the same time, she has acquired a reputation. So everyone's like, oh yeah, come on, she's going to enter the room, and yeah, exactly, the eye rolls of she's going to talk a lot. Her husband is complaining about her. So that has a very silencing effect, right? That somebody who's speaking truth to power should have a reputation like that. And then you have characters, say, for example, like Ophelia in Hamlet. She is so silent. She's not even encouraged to have a public voice until it sort of erupts from her in her allegedly mad scenes. So when we are teaching these texts, I think we really should be minded to amplify women's voices today. So scholars and practitioners working on these texts today. Otherwise, we will be sort of reenacting what is happening in the texts already. So doubling down on it, as it were.
Yeah.
And so I think that that is where, say, for example, podcasts can come in really handy because they very much can amplify women's voices. And the good thing about podcasts in Shakespeare studies is that a lot of them, first of all, are led by women. So, for example, Women and Shakespeare, of course, is one, but That Shakespeare Live, Protest Too Much, The Hurly Burly Shakespeare Show, This Shakespeare is Gay. And if they are not led by women, they feature a lot of women. So your podcast does that. Folger Shakespeare Libraries podcast does that. So podcasts are a great medium in Shakespeare studies for getting students to listen to all of these women experts. So I think that is how they can be useful. Another thing that you mentioned already is practitioners' voices. And what we have very little of still is actually a diversity of actresses talking about their conception of the roles. And again, this is very important that we listen to it because women characters are silent on the page. So, for example, in Hamlet, Gertrude speaks very little. However, she's present in so many scenes. In As You Like It, Celia speaks very little, but she's present in so many scenes. And sometimes scholars have a tendency to dismiss these roles and say, well, they're not so important. But actually, maybe they're more important because Shakespeare is trusting the actors to bring their interpretations to fill these silences. And actresses regularly do that, right? So what is Gertrude thinking at a particular moment? What is Celia's reaction to a particular thing? And so we need actresses to illuminate all of these kind of silences for us. And so I suggest that podcasts can be a great audio archive for this sort of thing when we are teaching students. So these are some of the ways in which I think podcasts can be used for feminist teaching. So what I'm doing in this book is sort of a contribution to what is called cyber feminism. So what you do is you use online digital technologies such as podcasts for feminist teaching. And then conversely, you use feminist teaching and feminist knowledge for sort of democratizing online spaces as well.
Excellent. There are about 5 things that you said that I'd like to pick up on. I might
Sure.
make it to 3 of them, but the archive is something that I think is so very important. Not only are we recovering and adding new things to Shakespeare studies, but what we are doing is that we're creating an archive of current living scholars. And even if they were men back in the day, I would love to hear George Lyman Kittredge's voice. I would love to hear E.K. Chambers' voice, whether I disagreed with him or not. But wouldn't it be wonderful? And that's it, the hearing, and that's what you did in the 16th century. You heard a play. But the thing is, even with all of the fine women and people of color, people from marginalized groups, you can read them. They're published. They're in academia, but you don't hear them sometimes. And I'm speaking as a man coming across. We talk about boundaries and gaps and so forth. So the next thing is that you can do this as a man in class. You can be awakened to the fact, and I think that there are plenty out there who do. Over the years, I've been more and more awakened to Beatrice and Much Ado. There are a couple of things that she says in there that are just stunning, that you kind of miss. She's not just an upset, haughty or whatever. She has this character.
Oh, she's my favorite. Yeah, she's my favorite.
Yeah, if I were a man, I would eat his heart in the marketplace.
Yes,
Goodness.
it's gorgeous, isn't it? It's so funny
My.
as well.
And so many other examples. I won't go on and on. I think I've said this before in this series that Juliet is the superior poet to Romeo. It is a testament maybe to the genius of Shakespeare that he saw that in adolescent women. They're just ahead. They're just ahead of the boys, and the boys.
Happens again and again, right? Romeo and Juliet, Twelfth Night,
Yeah,
As You Like It. You see that happen again and again, that women have to teach these men how to live, how to love. I often wonder maybe that having married somebody older than him, Shakespeare was seeing how to be led by a woman.
That's an interesting point. That really is. And so I don't find that this should be received as something that men can't help do also.
Oh, yes.
Also, what I do see is that uh, I think I told you off camera, you just don't see things sometimes. You grow up in your own way of looking at the world, and it's structured, and this can happen in disciplines and subdisciplines. You develop some bad habits, let's say, that you don't even know you have. And
Absolutely.
you're not being anti-feminist or racist or anything. It's just the structure of the rhetoric over years and years of Shakespearean criticism can of course very heavily lean male, but you don't even see it when it just kind of does sometimes. And
Yeah, and I think it's so important to stress the systemic. Because, it's not about individuals, it is about the system that promotes this kind of learning and this kind of teaching. So as you were saying, we'd really deliberately have to unlearn these bad habits and sort of concentrate. And I think that is why listening to or talking to a range of perspectives is so important, because they'll tell you about the gaps you've had in your own teaching that you hadn't realized, and you would suddenly be like, oh yeah, that's not okay, that's detrimental to teaching Shakespeare in a holistic way.
yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I could go on for about the next 2 or 3 years on this very topic. We got to move through, and we got to get to you specifically. A recent edition. It's not out yet, but you
No,
just wrote an introduction to one of my favorite plays, Midsummer Night's Dream. I teach it every year. You just wrote a critical introduction to a major edition. Now, tell us a little something about that.
that was, pun intended, a dream commission for me. And because this is A Midsummer Night's Dream, I did not read it as a kid, actually. I read it much later in life. And it was the first Shakespeare play that I had bought with my own money to deliberately read. And the edition that I had bought was the Oxford World's Classics edition. And I knew we'd be talking about this, so I have it with me right now. This is the exact copy that I bought
That's the one that you
all of
bought.
these
Yeah.
years ago.
I have them just right here behind me. Yes. And also art and
Right?
everything. I don't want to, but it
Yeah, yeah,
depends
yeah.
from edition to edition which one you find you like the most. So you're under this, talk about the anxiety of influence, what the old Harold Bloom thing, that you're under this formative period in your life where you read these critics and now you have to step forward and assert your interpretation.
Yeah, and that is exactly why it was such a full circle moment for me, right? That I was told that Professor Emma Smith, she said, "Do you want to write an introduction for this same series, Oxford World's Classics edition of A Midsummer Night's Dream?" And so it was such a full circle moment for me, because I was thinking, just as I've read these critics, I will be the voice introducing this play to a generation. So I got very like sentimental and ecstatic about it. So I jumped at the chance. But as you were saying, it is a daunting and a challenging task. It's such a well-beloved play. So much has been written about it. And I had only 15,000 words in which to do this. Yeah,
That's not
absolutely.
very
It
much.
is. No, it's short and concise. But I also enjoyed this so much because I think that this play is airy, light, silly, funny, if you want it to be, but it is also very profound.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the way in which it is profound, I can actually illustrate this very quickly by telling you about a very tiny story that actually opens my introduction. And it is an ancient Chinese story, and it is from Zhuangzi, and which is one of the foundational texts of Taoist philosophy. And the translation I'm reading is by Xiaoxing Han. And this is it. So the story goes, once upon a time, I, Zhangzi, dreamed I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither, to all intents and purposes, a butterfly. I was conscious only of following my fancies as a butterfly and was unconscious of my individuality as a man. Suddenly, I awaked, and there I lay, myself again. So now I do not know whether I was then Zhangzi, dreaming I was a butterfly, or a butterfly is now dreaming that it is me.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So I begin with this story because it is so similar to what A Midsummer Night's Dream does. So by showing us multiple dreamers and multiple dreams, it starts to question the nature of reality. And it starts to question the nature of who is dreaming, whose reality are we in? And so I think it joins all the philosophical, spiritual, psychological texts about dreaming, and everyone joins this. So there's the Bible, Indian Vedas and Puranas and Upanishads talk about dreams. So I think that Midsummer Night's Dream contributes to this discourse because it really makes us question our systemic realities, right? Because they are so embedded that we begin to think this is what the real world is like. But by questioning our reality, it sort of questions our systems and says, aren't they constructed? Isn't it constructed?
Hmm.
So I was very interested in that.
Hmm.
And one of the constructed realities that it really pushes sort of back on is this notion of heteronormativity. So our assumption that everyone is heterosexual and wants to live a heterosexual life, that becomes because it's so embedded in our system, we forget that it is a constructed reality. Not everyone is like this. And I remember seeing a production, and it was for, in England, and it was adapted for television by Russell T Davies. And the ending of that production featured a lesbian kiss. And you can imagine the absolute backlash and uproar that happened. The play itself talks about same-sex desire pretty passionately. So when I think Helena talks about to Hermia, and she's kind of, talking about their very, very passionate friendship. So I have written about how this is a queer play and challenges that kind of, thing that we take for reality. Then there is hierarchies in Midsummer Night's Dream that are set up only to be dismantled brick by brick. So I write about that. Then there's this kind of Western idea, which becomes a sort of reality in many people's minds, that as a species, humans are separate from what we might call nature. And that is something that the play again dismantles, because you have a character, for example, called Moth, and Moth is supposed to be a fairy. So are we talking about the species of fairy or moth or both? There's also Bottom, of course, who has a donkey head at one point. So is he a man? Is he a donkey? So I love this kind of, species boundaries. So it's kind of a play that really challenges these things that have settled into realities but are not. But as we were talking again off camera, it is a very nightmarish play as well, right? So it contains very sexist stories. Even the opening scene, we have Duke Theseus and Aegeus bearing down on the will of this young woman, Hermia. We have Oberon, the king of fairies, who drugs the queen of fairies, Titania, and she sleeps with ass-headed Bottom at that point. So huge issues of consent there. I've always thought it's like Taming of the Shrew on a celestial scale. So I wanted to draw attention to that. And I also wanted to draw attention to the nightmare that are colonial dreams that Britain is seeing at the time in which Midsummer Night's Dream is being written, because there is a very interesting character who perhaps appears on stage, perhaps not, but is very important to the plot of the play, right? The Indian boy. And that references the commodities that were being traded between India and Britain at the time. But he also references that human traffic. So there was a lot of trafficking of young boys that took place. So I wanted to draw attention to that. And I focus on the fact, and I argue very strongly that actually relationship between India and Britain is one of the seeding sources, and it's in Shakespeare's mind as he's writing this play. So those are some of the things that I concentrate on. I'm also very interested in the amazing production history of this play. So I tried to include as many productions as I could from a global stage. But there are so many that I haven't included, and obviously they are sitting on my conscience. But I could spend a lifetime writing about A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I think I might. Who knows?
Every time I do one of these talks, I look and I said, I should have said this at that point. And it was just a good chance to make a point. We all have had the experience of having something come out in publication, and then later you go, oh, I wish I could have added that or this. This is just, it's post-lapsarian, our state of being, that we desire for perfection, but we can't quite get it. It sounds to me that you had a limited amount of time and that you structured this thing perfectly in ways that I can't wait to read, because now I feel some regret because we just finished a term last semester. I could have entered this in to the teaching of Midsummer Night's Dream, because I didn't contextualize the Indian boy in trade. And now I've recognized, and my students recognize there's a problem there, and also there are many problems in there. And at the same time, you do have a woman who is being pressed down by powerful men, and she stands up to them. And you have the example of a warrior woman. She lost a war. Well, big time warriors lose wars sometimes. You have all kinds of things coming at you that seem to be, there seems to be a kind of awakening, from a prior era to the modern sensibilities that people are starting to take things into question, that sort of thing. But, we could go on and on
Yeah,
about.
and creatives have as well, right? So creatives have latched onto these impulses in the play, and they have written their own reparative stories.
Yeah.
So, for example, I was reading about this play, which I mentioned in the introduction. It's called The Revenge of the Amazons.
Hmm.
And it is all about, so Hippolyta calls on her Amazonian tribe, and she takes revenge for kind of, being captured. And instead of the play within the way play with the artisans and the mechanicals, this play has a very consciousness raising play for women. So creatives have taken this opportunity and latched onto it to make their own reparative drama from it.
Well, that's exactly what Shakespeare's doing. Uh, in
That's it.
in this mix of sources, the brilliant mix of sources that he has there, and restructuring certain narratives and so forth. All right. Well, again, I could talk about Midsummer all day long with you. Wonderful. Congratulations. I know that was a difficult thing to do, challenging, but what a wonderful opportunity. Your name's out there, you see, Varsha. That's the way it is. Because,
I cannot thank actually Emma for placing her trust in me that way.
yeah, well, I have nothing but laudatory things to say about Emma Smith. But behind me here, these editions and so forth, we read critic after critic. Sometimes we don't get to everything. In fact, most of the time, there's a lot of stuff that comes out. But one thing that remains are those names on the spines of those books that of the editors. That's what's here 20 years from now. Whereas some of the other stuff may not be. You don't know what's going to last or but that edition will stick. So wonderful. Congratulations on that. And I cannot wait to read it. But I want to get to the base of your critical praxis, the Indian stuff. And so we're going to start. We talked about this a bit off camera also. We're going to start in India, and then we're going to come across to Great Britain, the West, all of these other places. But you are basically, you've established yourself as an expert in Bollywood, in the Indian drama that is the outgrowth of colonialization and post-colonial thinking. Shakespeare was dragged in, and let's talk about this. Some things that come in that are imported, forcefully imported, are not bad. A lot of stuff is extremely bad, but not. I think Shakespeare is a plus.
Well, I think the way you do it is going to impact a lot.
Yeah.
So when it was kind of a colonial import at the time, some sort of when it was introduced in the curriculum, it was introduced in the curriculum for specific things. And one of those specific things that was being aimed at was that it would crush indigenous language and pride in indigenous culture. And that happened for a while, that, we lost touch with our culture and our arts, and so on. And the second reason why it was introduced was because the British wanted to create a class of Indians who would be, brown on the outside, but English in their sensibilities and cultural affinities and so on. And in effect, that kind of lasts to this day. And so you get these kinds of mixtures now where I'm a brown woman and I love Shakespeare. And that is their mission. However, what happened also, and which they did not predict, but often happens, is that you take things in a country that the colonizer gives you. and then you remake them for your own purpose in your own image, right? So you take the English language, you take cricket, you take Shakespeare, and then you reproduce it in your own image. So a lot of theater companies, what they started doing, they were doing Hindi translations, Gujarati, Marathi translations of Shakespeare, and then they were mixing Shakespeare with local stories. So they were mixing Romeo and Juliet with the Ramayana, and they were adding songs and dances to these. And they were really using them as fodder for their own productions. And that, I think, is a wonderful thing, because that is where interculturalism is happening, rather than something that is imitative and shuts down your own culture.
Yeah, Japan was very good from the very beginning about the word. It is not a bad word. It works. I've checked it. Japanizing Shakespeare right there. Very happy to take your stories. And very happy. The Shakespeare thing, big deal for these guys over there who are kind of big deals, but we're going to do our thing with it. And that exists now. But that's not the same thing. And I talked with Stephen Wittick about this, that it's not the same thing in India, because India was colonized. And of course, Japanese was the colonizer, not the colonizee. So this threat of losing your own tongue, losing your native tongue, but not only one, but a bunch of not dialects, native regional languages. I went through and looked into this, and I had no idea there were that many languages that are, I mean, not just people out in the hills or someplace. These are official provincial languages that are spoken. So you could run across an Indian now who could speak 3, 4, 5 languages inside of India, right?
Yeah, I do too. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of diversity, we don't think about that. We don't think about the diversity. And what that does is that brings a heck of a lot into the creative space of trying to produce this foreign cultural thing that you can recognize. There's one thing Shakespeare is, and many writers, of course, but Shakespeare is just so recognizable because of those basic elements in the plots and stories. Of course, he's drawing those from other plots and stories. He could recognize that. All right, so you've worked on the Bollywood. I wanted to make sure that people know Bollywood is extraordinarily productive. It produces far more films than Hollywood. Hollywood has all the money, and for better or for worse. But Bollywood is an incredibly active and it's just been around for a while, and it is and it's produced these wonderful directors. Could we talk a little bit? You wrote on one director, and I had it in my notes here, but I'll hand it to you. You're the expert.
No, thank you. I grew up watching Bollywood Shakespeare, right? So those are Bollywood movies based on Shakespeare's plays. Now, when I was watching these movies, of course, I did not know that I'm watching Shakespeare, but I was.
You are,
And
yeah.
I was such a fan of Bollywood since the beginning. My mom tells me I was so fascinated by Bollywood cinema that my mom used to use it for babysitting. So she would just put on these Bollywood movies, and I would sit there entertaining myself for hours. And there was actually a cinema hall that was right next to our house. And we went so often that the staff very much became friendly with us. So mom would just drop me at the cinema and then come and pick me up later. That is what was happening. So I am really not surprised that later in my life, I have returned to analyzing and engaging with Bollywood Shakespeare, and also with Shakespeare within Indian cinema just generally, because again, Bollywood is the largest film industry in India. but there are other film industries in India, more regional in different languages and so on. And actually, Bollywood and Shakespeare have a very long history. So, in fact, in 2023, when a lot of the world was celebrating the 400th anniversary of the first folio, the first collected volume of Shakespeare's works from 1623, a bunch of us were celebrating the centenary of the first known Shakespeare film from India. And so, because that was a 1923 silent movie, and it was based on, of all Shakespeare's plays, on Cymbeline. So we were celebrating 100 years of that. And since then, there have been a number of directors directing movies based on Shakespeare. And there's a wonderful list of this filmography if someone's minded to look it up. And it's in an edited collection, Shakespeare and Indian Cinema. However, like not many people know about these films in the UK. There's much more awareness now. But, maybe 5 years, 6 years ago, when I would talk about these films, people would say, what? Bollywood Shakespeare? Is India interested in Shakespeare? Are there more movies than you're just mentioning? And I would like be very gracious in responding, but I would be very triggered by this because it was such a passion of mine. So actually in 2016, 4 of us got together. So that is Koyal Chatterjee, Thea Buckley, and Preeti Taneja and I. And we organized a big film festival, international conference, and an exhibition called Indian Shakespeare's on Screen. And during this, we screened Vishal Bhardwaj's Shakespeare trilogy, which has become quite famous. Many people know about it, which is Makbul, Macbeth, Omkara, which is based on Othello, and Hyder, that is based on Hamlet. So we screened these movies in central London at BFI South Bank. And then we invited the director and script writers to have public conversations. So that is kind of my journey with these Bollywood Shakespeare films.
It's just wonderful. And along with the people you've mentioned, friends of our program, Diana Henderson, who
yes,
is involved in digital studies like you are, and also Mark Thornton Burnett.
Both of these were speakers at our conference, so
okay.
Absolutely.
And more. There are a lot of people out there. So marginalized, but getting to be less and less marginalized. It also helps
Absolutely.
to have someone who understands the language. But here we have this colonial instinct to, what do you call it, Englishify these others over here, make them more English or more British or whatever, and giving them the things that would help them, cricket or whatnot. Of course, later on, they start beating the British team in cricket, but
That's it.
which, to the dismay of everyone there, I'm sure. But they take it, and it's the old Lutheran mistake. If everybody reads the Bible, they'll see exactly what I see. But no, here we have it, and then it's taken and it's taken into the culture, mixed in, and becomes a thing itself that is distinctly Indian, if we could say that. That is more locally based, and then it is imported, but then I get this confused, exported back to the UK. And that's where you get in also with this idea of recontextualizing Indian Shakespeare's. I wanted to focus just a bit on your article in that. It was a wonderful article on subtitles. You and I you grew up in this world. I would imagine you grew up in a world of subtitles. Most Americans, and just English, and maybe, put on the closed caption if you have trouble hearing. But I live in a world of subtitles. And I use AI in my teaching because sometimes we have kids out there, if it gets a little bit into the weeds, they can read English very well. And now the auto translation is very good. But I've noticed as I've learned more and more Japanese that I've noticed some things. And, you know, it depends on who is doing it. But you're arguing there's actually two sets of subtitles in depending on which culture you're aiming for. So tell us something about that.
Sure. So all of this actually began in the lead up to the events for Indian Shakespeare's on screen, right? So we were screening these movies,
Mm-hmm.
and increasingly all the organizers were thinking about practical and logistical questions to do with these screenings, because we were thinking, okay, how much cultural knowledge is actually required, right, to appreciate these movies? Because we're now away from Bollywood and we're now screening these movies in a different context. So, how much cultural knowledge should we give our audiences? Is it patronizing to do that? Is it helpful to do that? Then we were thinking about, okay, well, how much information should we give the reviewers and the critics? Then we were thinking, well, who has the right to review and critique these movies? Then we were thinking about subtitles. And we were thinking about, okay, how are the subtitles mediating between now a Shakespeare movie that has been produced in India and is very Indian in its grammar, but is now being screened in London? And London, should we assume London is multicultural enough to cope with that? So these were some of the kind of practical questions that were in our mind, which is what led to this edited collection that I have with Koyal Chatterjee, Recontextualizing Indian Shakespeare Cinema in the West. And my article in that talks about subtitles because what we wanted was a sense that we need a critical framework that can allow for both familiarity and strangeness. So the subtitle of our book is Familiar Strangers. And what we are arguing is that Indian Shakespeare cinema is a familiar stranger in the West. So it might seem contradictory, but both are true, right? So it is a stranger because it takes birth in Indian soil. It speaks Indian languages, but it is familiar because it is Shakespeare, right? So it's both inside and it's both outside. It's familiar, it's strange. So we need a critical framework that can do recognize both these contradictory impulses simultaneously. So that something that is very familiar should be made strange sometimes for us to be able to see it properly because we are so familiar with it. And then sometimes some things that might seem very strange, like songs and dances in Indian cinema, can actually be very familiar, but things we had overlooked, so that we know that even Shakespeare uses songs and dances for narratives, some things that we forget. So we needed a critical framework that would do both, appreciate familiarities and appreciate strangenesses. Mm-hmm. So my argument in the subtitling chapter is that sometimes subtitlers will really try and pander to the kind of, audiences, English audiences that are watching. And what they would do is make it so familiar that they would really strip the movie of its Indianness and the grammar of kind of, the Indian vocabularies or, food mentioned or salutations or idioms. And they would translate those in subtitle form into Western idioms. So they would make it too familiar. And then the problem with that is that obviously my hope is that anyone who's going to see these international movies is very well prepared to meet some strangeness and work hard to appreciate those differences. But if they'll find it so familiar, that would be lost. They wouldn't be able to do that. They wouldn't be able to appreciate a different culture. They wouldn't realize that actually effort is required, research is required to appreciate a different culture. So I was arguing that actually subtitles should retain the flavor of the originary culture and not make things that might be strange too familiar for an audience, because it undoes the good work that the movie has done by really embedding Shakespeare in its kind of, in the context of Bollywood, in the context of a local grammar.
I fully agree, and I've just thought about any number of examples that we could bring up. The thing about your work is that there are a lot of people. There's a lot of material. There's an enormous amount of there's an enormous range of things that you are talking about, that you feel that if you focus on just one thing, that you are somehow ignoring another. So I'm overlooking some things I would like to say, perhaps, but I have seen it in terms of how Japanese cinema sometimes is translated, and also how English language cinema is subtitled in Japan. Sometimes they go a little too quickly in both cases for the easy out, right? So a word that can mean like mendokusai, that can mean troublesome. That's what you see in the dictionary. What it really means in the context is pain in the behind, right? In that
Yes.
context. In another context, it could be troublesome. And I'm sure there are countless examples in various Indian languages and so forth. But what I think our viewers and listeners would like to hear, though, is that it sounds to us like you are what we call it in Japan, it's Issei. Is it first generation that you grew up in India? And so you moved. Just if you could, just tell us how you got to where you are there in London doing Shakespeare. We already know a little something, but some more perhaps.
I was attracted to Shakespeare out of rebellion from my parents. So, good old story, a very familiar thing.
Hermia.
So, so I was in India, and my parents are. So my dad is an engineer. My mother is a doctor, a medical doctor. So the stereotype of, Indian parents recognizing only a few professions for their children was very true in my case. So they wanted me to become an engineer, actually. And so they said that for my A-levels equivalent, I had to take, and I'm not kidding you, my subjects were computer science, physics, mathematics, chemistry, and I was allowed to do English. I was allowed to take English literature. So you can imagine that my entire focus was English literature because I hated the idea of going into STEM subjects. I did not want to. I did not want to follow my parents, and I wanted to study literature. And so as I was studying English literature, a mega part of the English literature curriculum, even at that time, was Shakespeare. So out of rebellion, I got really interested in Shakespeare. I read Shakespeare vociferously. I read Shakespeare illicitly. I read Shakespeare when I should be doing physics. So sometimes I was like Juliet, moonlighting in literary classes where I should have been somewhere else. Sometimes I was kind of taking inspiration from Taming of the Shrew and putting my foot down that I won't have tutors for mathematics. So it was a very kind of, it was a love affair that started due to rebellion. But what it did for me actually was that it actually made me read in that manner, read Shakespeare in that manner. So what I mean by that is that I was looking for characters. They were mostly women characters, but sometimes male characters as well, who were trying to rebel their circumstances. So I would very much concentrate on them and say, oh, so, and this is a habit now. So when I came to A Midsummer Night's Dream, I was like, go Hermia, because she's rebelling her circumstances when we begin the play. So this became a habit of reading for me. And then, of course, I thought I would follow my dreams and I will go as far away from my parents as I can. I will come to England and I would read Shakespeare. So I did not tell my parents that I was applying for universities here as an undergraduate until I had a visa appointment and I somehow got the visa. I convinced them that my dad is so and so in this company to give me a visa without his bank statements, which I cannot imagine doing in this day and age. And then once I got the visa, I told them that I am going with or without your blessing to follow my heart, very Desdemona-like. And at that point, my dad was not an Aegeus, I have to say. He supported me and he saw I have this passion. So that is why I ended up here. And actually, when I came here, one habit of the mind that I continued doing is what led me to actually the familiar strangers sort of idea. Because I know that familiar strangers is a network that different theorists use in different kind of contexts. But for me, that was a practical life skill, right? Like when you move from one culture to another, what you're constantly doing is you're looking for contact points. So things that are familiar, and you kind of go like, we do this in our culture. Oh yeah, this is how you do it here. So this is like a familiarity we can bond over. And then you register differences. Like, oh, that feels strange to them, but this feels strange to me. And you learn to not only accept, but you learn to celebrate those differences. And I found that a good method for interpreting cultures, a good method for interpreting texts, a good method for interpreting Shakespeare. So it all kind of, a lot of my what I do critically does come from my experiences of Shakespeare as well, moving across different cultures.
That's just wonderful. And so you stayed in London. Do you get home much? Do you?
Very much so. And I love everything about Indian culture. So I go home a lot. I mean, home is London now as well. I am a citizen of this country now. But I will say I do have a dual home because if I'm not going back to India, India is in my mind, in my heart, in my work. And when I'm in India, London and Britain is in my heart and in my work, and always has been with Shakespeare.
Yeah. Uh, just wonderful story. I have one little anecdote I'd like to share with you because
Yes,
I didn't
please.
grow up. I didn't grow up around Indian people, obviously from the states in the American South. Although South Carolina recently had an Indian governor, Nikki Haley. She might not
Mhm.
share our particular opinions, political opinions, but did quite well. It's doing quite well, and and there is an Indian community even in little old South Carolina, people who are very
Wow.
industrious uh, and I just have always found a uh, what the Venn diagram, a sort of overlap, and I'm not sure where it is, but I did a conference years ago, about 25 years ago, maybe more, and I had to fly from Tokyo to the United Arab Emirates, UAE, for the conference
Yeah.
in Dubai. And the flight was Cathay Pacific, so it was just this Airbus. It was a real bus. It went to Hong Kong, then Thailand, then to Mumbai, and then to Dubai. So along the way, and
Wow.
back then you didn't have these consoles with all these movies. You had the one movie that they selected for you, and you just had to
Yes, I
like it or lump
remember.
it. That was it. Yeah, and uh, so it starts out with mostly Japanese, Chinese, and then Japanese, Chinese, and then we had Thai. But in Thailand, there were all of these Indian workers who were going home, and the movie in that stretch, in that leg, was Mr. Bean. And I was in an entire section of the plane. It was a smaller section of the plane, and with 90% Indian guys, and they were rolling in the aisles laughing over Mr. Bean. I didn't really know Mr. Bean that well. And they were grabbing me and saying, da, 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 da. It was so interactive. I mean, you were in this immediate family of people. And I thought about this when when you were talking about Indian cinema. We're not talking about people sitting politely and so forth.
Oh, no.
There is an enormous amount of reaction. It was just delightful. I liked the audience better than I liked Mr. Bean. It was just so much fun to be with those guys. But they got the humor. And the strange thing, the Chinese and Japanese guys were kind of looking around, like, just don't get it because, of course, it's Mr. Bean. So uh, that what can we say about that? There are certain basic fundamental human things that cross. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the Indian sense of humor seems to be a good point of.
Yeah, and I actually think that Shakespeare is very interactive theater, right? It's only
Yeah,
now we get to Shakespeare and we think, oh, we're sitting politely applauding at everything.
yeah.
But in Shakespeare's time, we have audiences that are responding, right? They're responding to these questions and soliloquies and big crowd scenes. And so I think that actually Shakespeare translates pretty well in India because Indian audiences also like to react.
Hmm.
They would react to their own plays, they react to films. I remember as a child that I wasn't a child actually. This is pretty embarrassing. I was about 18 when I remember dancing in the aisles while going and seeing Bollywood movies. So I think that the interactivity of Shakespeare and the interactivity of Bollywood cinema actually match up very well as well.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I do think some of the tricky things in Shakespeare that maybe we kind of see as too tricky. Oh, I don't know. Hero, let's just say hero at the end of Much Ado. And the whole thing of unveiling it seems to me that that is just made for Bollywood. That whole idea of, oh, I'm alive, it's me, that kind of thing. And some other, well, there are bed tricks and so forth, the three famous ones, I think. And those kinds of things seem to be almost engineered, like for Bollywood.
Every time a character who is dead comes alive is, I think, made for India because we believe in reincarnation, don't we? So we have no
Aha.
problem with sort of seeing people who are supposedly dead coming back for a new life, new rebirths, new kind of narratives. So yeah, I would say that every time that happens in Shakespeare, and it seems to happen a lot, I feel, oh, that is so Indian.
Oh yeah, there's your Winter's Tale and other how many other places.
Absolutely.
Uh, that's just wonderful. Now, Varsha, it's your morning, and I have kept you. Now, what I want to do is before we get off, I want to know what's next. What's coming up? You're going to continue the podcast, right?
Oh, for sure. I cannot stop. There are so many brilliant women I still have to talk to. So that is
Yeah.
definitely ongoing.
Yeah. I've gotten into this. I feel bad that I can't do it every day, right? It's just it takes some preparation, of course, but there's so
I
many good
absolve
people.
you. I have been so delayed with editing my podcast. I absolve you from the guilt of not doing it every day.
Well, you've been busy. You've been very busy. But what's coming up? What can what's going to happen in the future? Of course, there's going to be that edition coming out of the
Yes.
Midsummer Night's Dream.
So right now, I'm actually working on diaspora Shakespeare.
Yes.
So because what I think, and I'm working in diaspora Shakespeare in the theatre. And because one thing that I think people often forget is that actually Shakespeare's plays were inspired by the diaspora of his time. So a famous example for would be Othello. And now many critics absolutely believe that the inspiration behind this play, the inspiration behind Othello as a character was the Moroccan ambassador who came to England at that time. So his name, I've noted it down so I don't mess it up, is Abdul Wahid bin Masood bin Muhammad al-Anuri or al-Anun. And when he came, Londoners were both really impressed by him because he was living in this posh area, Strand, and he was going to see the Queen. But they were also what might be considered very xenophobic in their sort of whispers about him that, oh, you know, this is his religion, they cut all their meats and so on. So this kind of ambiguous attitude to this Moroccan ambassador, we can see that in Othello, right? Like people are impressed by him, he's a general, but they still want to keep him at a distance. And, you know, they don't want to marry their daughters to him.
No.
So, absolutely. So, so Shakespeare himself is inspired by diaspora. And Shakespeare is inspired by the traders who are coming in with their spices when he writes about spiced Indian air. So in all sorts of ways, he is himself inspired by all of these intercultural nodes. And my contention in the book that I'm writing, which is provisionally titled British South Asian Shakespeare's on Stage, Politics and Performance. And my contention is that the creatives who are from these kind of diasporic spaces or have been migrants themselves, they have a unique insight into these moments and these characters or the interculturalism that is embedded into Shakespeare's plays. So when they produce Shakespeare's plays, they can do something twofold. They can illuminate Shakespeare's plays and the embedded interculturalism of it, but they can also use Shakespeare's plays as leverage for airing their own concerns. And there have been a number of companies that have done that. And we can talk about any diaspora, but because I am British Asian, I'm going to focus on British Asian diaspora. And there have been many companies like Tara Arts, like Manila, like Physical, like Tribe Arts, who have done a number of Shakespeares. And so my book is going to sort of tell us about these diaspora Shakespeares. And I want to very much say how these British Asian creatives have used Shakespeare as an ally, but are also shaping the legacy of Britain's most powerful cultural icon, Shakespeare. So my hope is that this book is going to very firmly remind us that Shakespeare is intertwined with Britain's multicultural past, present, and hopefully the future. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Oh, this is going to be it's just wonderful because also it brings awareness to the notion of how many people have migrated from these areas, not just from the Asian subcontinent to the West, but within the Asian subcontinent. There are many cultures there. Well, like on that airplane, I'm flying with guys who are working in Thailand, right? That's not their home. That's not where they grew up. And of course, I'm on a whole airplane full of people just moving around through this entire area. I think, of course, in the American landscape, the United States, people wandering in from the South or whatnot it just overwhelms media. Of course, that's been an issue in Europe and so forth. But this migratory thing that is just part of human history.
Oh yeah, and Shakespeare's time as well, right? So
Yes.
like in Macbeth, he's talking about the fact that the monarch who was a Scottish monarch is now the English monarch. So James the Sixth is now James the First of England.
Yes.
And there's confusion about identity and migration there. And in fact, one of the British Asian companies that I talk about did a wonderful production of Macbeth, sort of drawing attention to British Asian migration and in-betweenness, and then how that maps onto the in-betweenness of English and Scottish kind of migration in Macbeth. So yes, migration has always been a part of Shakespeare as well.
Yes, very much, very much. Okay. You are going to be looking at your watch pretty soon here because I have kept you too long. You've been too gracious, and we had to wait a little bit on you because you had to get finished with that introduction and some other stuff.
Oh yeah.
And what I would love to do here is just thank you so much, Varsha, because we do a lot of we try to diversify this podcast as much as possible, but to have your voice in here, it was really, really good for us. You're younger, you're part of a new generation coming up, and you are bringing in these new perspectives and so forth. And I wanted to extend my greatest thanks to you for joining us today.
Oh no, thank you so much for having me. One rarely gets a chance to talk about one's own work at length. So this was great. Thank you for inviting me and being such a gracious host. And thank you for calling me young. I don't get that more anymore.